Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with the Leventhal Map and Education Center at Boston Public Library. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, the creator and producer of this author series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight, looking at how maps and cartography reflect our world, America, and Americans in the past and in the present day. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book Radical Cartography. Soon, author William Rankin will take the screen to discuss his book and share some amazing maps. Then he'll be joined in conversation by tonight's moderator, Ian Spangler of the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. Following their conversation, the duo will address your questions, which can be entered at any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We welcome your input and your queries. Tonight's event is being produced and recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. A link to the rebroadcast will be distributed to all registered attendees in the day ahead. As good as tonight's program or the videos to come, as good as they might be, of course, the real education and enlightenment comes from reading the hard copy of tonight's featured work. Copies of Radical Cartography can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and sent anywhere in the United States. As you order on the bookstore's website, input the code AMINS25 so you get a specially signed book-plated edition. For map lovers and social scientists among your family and friends, Radical Cartography could be the perfect gift. Now, for some background on tonight's guests, William Rankin is an historian of science at Yale University, where he focuses on the history of mapping and geographic sciences. Born and raised outside Chicago, he was originally trained as an architect before receiving a dual PhD in the history of science and architecture from Harvard. In addition to his work as an historian, he is also an award-winning cartographer, and his maps have appeared in numerous books, magazines, and exhibits around the world. Tonight's moderator, Ian Spangler, is Associate Curator of Digital and Participatory Geography at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. He is a cultural and economic geographer with interests in digital mapping, housing studies, and race and landscape in the United States. He earned his BA in English and Geography from the University of Mary Washington and his MA and PhD in Geography from the University of Kentucky. Mr. Spangler will join us in the second half of our program, but for now, welcome to you, Professor Rankin, joining us from New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you so much for fitting us into your busy teaching schedule and department head, I hear. And thanks for sharing also this remarkable, educational, and truly beautiful book. As folks will soon see, there are so many wonderful and also actionable maps in it. Let's get started right away. So over to you, and again, welcome.
That's great. Thank you so much, Margaret. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's great to be a guest. I am so looking forward to sharing my new book and to your questions and engagement in the Q&A. So I'm going to start on the east side of Detroit, like this, in the 1960s. In particular, I'm going to focus on this neighborhood here, which is in between downtown here on the left and the Grosse Pointe suburbs here on the right. You can see there's a highway that connected the two, but this highway was often clogged with traffic. And this dynamic, the downtown, suburbs, the highway, and this neighborhood in between, it gave rise to a map that's something of a classic among a certain slice of geographers and map makers. It's a powerful map. The title is A Kick in the Face, Where Commuters Run Over Black Children on the Point Downtown Track. The neighborhood was majority Black, The suburbs of Grosse Pointe were almost entirely white. The map shows a total of 196 collisions, and you can see that they're clustered along the east-west streets that commuters would use to avoid the traffic on the highway. It was the greatest concentration of child pedestrian accidents in the city, and the map conjures the entire American urban crisis in a few lines and dots. White flight, the inner city, structural violence of the most literal sort. The map is attributed to the rather abrasive geographer activist William Bungay, also known as Wild Bill Bungay. It was published in 1971 in a small typewritten journal he had started a few years before, right after being fired from his second and last academic job. Bungay, like the map, isn't that well known outside the world of left-wing geographers, but within that world, he's often remembered as one of its first radical practitioners, one of the first to disavow the priorities of the academy and to focus on the urgent politics of the time. The journal was part of a new kind of research and teaching collaborative he had co-founded called the Detroit Geographical Expedition and Institute. It was a loose collection of academics and community members that made maps of the city, wrote reports about school desegregation, and taught free classes that the state had agreed to accept for university credit. Bungay was white, in his early 40s, and came from an upper middle class family in Wisconsin. His main collaborator was an impassioned Black teenager named Gwendolyn Warren, who had quit high school after leading 4,000 of her fellow students in an anti-racist boycott of the public school system. Their experiment was short-lived. Thousands of students took the free classes, but Bungay and Warren clashed on key points of strategy, and within a couple of years, the state changed its mind about giving credit. Even before the Point Downtown map was published, Bungay himself had fled to Canada after appearing on a list of, quote, radical and/or revolutionary speakers compiled by the US House of Representatives, along with others like Muhammad Ali, Stokely Carmichael, and Angela Davis. I first came across this map about 20 years ago. I had just finished architecture school and was making maps in my spare time. I had already decided to switch fields and become a historian, but mapping was a way of keeping me engaged with the world of design. I had made a few maps that had found some traction online, but I was getting frustrated with aesthetics as an end in itself, and a friend recommended that I look at Bungay. The map was a revelation. It wasn't just about showing data in a clean and interesting way. It was interpretive, political, urgent. When Bungay published versions of the map in his later books, the questions he asked were about responsibility. Who was responsible for these accidents? The drivers, yes, but what about the urban planners who kept the traffic patterns unchanged? What about the broader policies, incentives, and systemic racism that led to such a divided city in the first place? So I found everything I could by Bungay: books, articles, posters. But I quickly faced a somewhat unpleasant realization. None of his other maps had this power, and I wasn't sure why. Here, for example, is another map of his of Detroit. Ethnic groups, sympathetic and unsympathetic to Black people. The dark areas are unsympathetic, the light gray areas are sympathetic. Or here's another, the region of rat-bitten babies. The gray stipple shows areas of frequent rat sightings. The dots are confirmed rat bites. Or again, here's the region of roaches, where over 20% of homes report roaches. Now, the topics here are important, even terrifying, but the maps just didn't seem to have the emotional punch of the Point Downtown map. My first instinct was to pick at all the small questions, like what makes an ethnic group sympathetic or not? What makes rat sightings frequent? Why is 20% the right number for the region of roaches? But I finally realized that what bothered me was broader. The problem is what I now call the map's visual argument, by which I mean not just what the data shows, but the map's overall conception of the kind of world we live in, what's in it, how it's put together. And nearly all of Bungay's maps show a world divided into clean and tidy shapes. places with roaches or rats, places without, friendly ethnic neighborhoods and unfriendly ones. And this was the visual argument that I found so uninspiring. There are no in-between spaces, no borderline cases, no interesting exceptions, not really even any human beings. And I concluded that even though Bunge's ideas about geographic research were something of a radical departure, his cartography wasn't radical at all. If anything, the world conjured by Bunge's maps is remarkably mainstream, even conservative. Simple shapes, sharp boundaries, monolithic classifications of people and space. For example, look at what happens when I redraw the point downtown map in a similar way. This is the exact same data, the same conclusion, but now the map is about classifying neighborhoods, not about the relationship between urban planning, race, and responsibility. To make this, I went back and digitized the original data for the whole city, but even showing that data, using 3 colors instead of 2, adding these vertical white lines for majority Black areas, the world here is still made of polygons. The core function of the map is still to delimit the boundaries of what would have been known at the time as the slums or the ghetto. This is a tool of classification, not of empathy. And I call this mainstream and conservative because easy categories and simple boundaries are the same logic used for redlining, gerrymandering, indigenous reservations, the religious ghettos of pre-war Europe, colonial partition, racial townships. This is how maps become useful for faraway management, expropriation, and control. Wrestling with Bunge's work led me to 2 conclusions, which changed not just the kind of maps that I wanted to make myself, but also the kinds of questions I ask as a historian. The first is the importance of focusing our attention, whether we are map makers or map readers, not just on the topic, on the data, the patterns, but on this larger idea of visual argument. And often, the kind of implicit politics of a map, the visual argument, can undermine the explicit argument, the explicit politics of the topic, the text, even the personal commitments of the map maker. The strongest way I've come to phrase this is that focusing on visual argument means seeing every map as a theory of geography. Maps are powerful sources of cultural imagination and shared assumptions, and they deserve to be treated that way. My second conclusion was that many of the heroes of the history of cartography needed a second look. Why was the point downtown map such an outlier in Bunge's work? A few years ago, documents from Detroit became available online, and Gwendolyn Warren, Bunge's main collaborator, started telling her own story. I got a hold of her, and I asked about the point downtown map, and she summarized Bunge's involvement in 2 words: total theft. It was Warren and her friends who spent a summer extracting data from a reluctant police department. It was Warren who first presented the map at a conference in 1970. It was Warren who had spent much of her childhood on the east side of Detroit, who had friends who died in the streets, who even herself had been bitten by a rat as a 10-year-old. The drafting of the map was done by one of her friends, Robert Ward Jr. Here's Warren on the left and Ward on the right. And it was Warren who wanted to focus on the relationship between individual experience and structural forces. In my research, I found another map of hers that has never been republished. It's 21 homes of Gwendolyn Warren, numbered 1 to 21, connected by arrows. When I asked her about it, she described to me an unending cycle of evictions, attending 15 schools in 10 years, the feeling of always living in the leftovers of white flight, and how similar her childhood was to all the other kids she grew up with. She said to me, quote, "It makes white people nervous. They don't like to see it. They want to talk about the roads, housing values, graduation rates. They don't want to talk about what happened to the people." So my talk tonight is going to have 3 parts. First, I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking in somewhat general terms about what I'm calling radical cartography. Radical cartography is the title I gave to the website that I created when I first started making maps 20 years ago, and it's now the title of my new book. Then second, I'm going to give some flesh to these ideas with an example from the first chapter of the book about the mapping of boundaries and neighborhoods in Chicago. Finally, I'm going to end with a very quick example of boundaries at a more regional scale. Now, in the full book, boundaries are one topic among many. I also look at the uses of layers and projections, color. I talk about the representation of people, the use of scale, understandings of time. But the way we understand boundaries is really central to the project as a whole, and I think focusing on boundaries gives a good sense for what I'm trying to do. So the central premise of radical cartography is that the politics of a map are embedded in its graphics. There is a long-standing set of graphic conventions and habits of mind that enable maps to act as tools of management, expropriation, and control. As a whole, these are conventions that render the world unnaturally solid and well-ordered. Radical cartography, in contrast, is not invested in solidity or order, but rather in uncertainty, multiplicity, and subjectivity. And these principles are political because they enable the visibility of inequality, of pluralism, and what feminist philosophers call situated epistemologies. This is the big move. Radical cartography is not some collection of particular graphic techniques or a way of advancing particular political positions. It's a different set of principles about how maps should construct the world. And what follows from these principles is really some skepticism for some of the most common features of our everyday maps. Sharp borders, highly aggregated statistics, neutral backgrounds, disregard for temporal change, and so on. Radical cartography shows a world that's messier and lumpier, with more overlaps and internal diversity, burdened by the weight of history, defined as much by personal experience as arm's-length detachment. Now, radical cartography is not a set of requirements. It's more like a set of possibilities. What distinguishes Warren's maps from Bunge's is not that Warren did everything different, but rather that the subjectivity, the experience driving her maps, is enough to establish a different relationship between the viewer and the world. The main thing I'm trying to challenge here is what I call the jigsaw puzzle map, the map of simple shapes and hard boundaries. Political maps are probably the easiest example of this, where every country is a single solid color, internally homogeneous, crisply bordered. Or here is the fun map from 1766 that is literally a jigsaw puzzle made out of wood, showing Europe divided into discrete autonomous kingdoms used to educate the children of the nobility. But this same jigsaw puzzle logic is seen in all sorts of more modern and data-driven maps as well, including Bunge's maps of rats and roaches. These kinds of maps are powerful cognitive tools. My broader target isn't just these specific graphics, but the assumptions behind this way of thinking. The bigger idea of a jigsaw puzzle map is that every feature on the map should be easily matched to a legend. Every reader should draw the same conclusions. Every point in space, both on the map and in the real world, should just have a single, clear, unambiguous value. I also want to say, though, that challenging the assumptions of absolute clarity, of neutrality, of these kinds of maps, does not mean challenging ideas like accuracy, reliability, or legibility. If anything, I think my approach produces an account of the world that is more reliable and more trustworthy, not less. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in practice by going back to Chicago in the 1920s. The city was experiencing huge population growth. Nearly a third of the residents were immigrants. World War I had launched the mass migration of African Americans from the South. At the University of Chicago, a group of sociologists saw this barely contained urban chaos as a great opportunity for their field. They wanted to distance themselves from the reformist impulses of social work, and they wanted to establish their young field as a proper scientific discipline. By the beginning of the 1930s, one of the main tools they used was a profound intellectual embrace of jigsaw puzzle cartography. Now, this wasn't the invention of this kind of mapping, but it was an important departure from what came before. Instead of mapping the local details of specific urban problems, the sociologists at Chicago saw jigsaw puzzles offering something more expansive and theoretical, And I think seeing how and why can tell us a lot about the politics embedded in these kinds of maps. The main figure here was Ernest Burgess. By temperament, he was kind of the opposite of Bill Bungay. He was shy, bookish, short, and totally committed to the academy. He presented his first map in 1923. It shows the entire metropolitan area at a very high level of abstraction. This is the so-called concentric ring theory of American urbanism. In the middle, we have the downtown business district, known in Chicago as the Loop, which is then surrounded by the so-called zone in transition, with its slums and vice and ethnic ghettos. And then there's a series of increasingly affluent residential areas, from working men's homes to single-family houses to wealthy commuters. And this is the map that launched it all. As one historian has said, quote, "There is no more famous diagram in social science." Intellectually, Burgess was borrowing a lot of ideas here from the natural sciences, especially theories in ecology about how plant communities respond in predictable ways to outside disturbance. In particular, Burgess took ecology as a model for thinking about urban segregation. He said that segregation was, quote, "not the product of race prejudice alone, but that it followed general laws of spatial sorting and succession." He also said that segregation had important benefits because it offered individuals and groups, quote, "a place and a role in the total organization of city life, with group cohesion offering an important guard against social disorganization." So this diagram, again, was meant to be deeply theoretical. It was to show how migrants from abroad or from the South would find their natural place and become integrated into the city. After this initial map, Burgess assembled a team of students and researchers to make this abstract idea more concrete. One path led to a number of books on specific urban problems, everything from cabarets and gangs to suicide. Here, for example, is a detail from a map showing the home addresses of thousands of male juvenile delinquents. These were called spot maps, and they generally supported the idea of concentric rings, with a concentration of social problems near downtown that attenuated into the suburbs. Or here is Burgess himself in front of another of these maps. But at the same time, another path led to maps of much less specificity, but ultimately much greater impact. The goal was to delimit the precise boundaries of what Burgess called the ecological areas of the city, using hard jigsaw puzzle shapes. Here, for example, is an early map in this tradition, where you can see every ethnic area here is drawn as a little blob, fitting in between infrastructure and industry in black and gray. It's almost like a little miniature map of Europe with only slight overlaps between adjacent blobs. And this line of research ultimately led to this map here, which looks kind of dry, but actually was super important. It shows the city divided into what Burgess called community areas. 75 jigsaw puzzle pieces, no overlap. This map was actually the result of a huge amount of research, much of which was led by an assistant named Vivian Palmer, who along the way actually wrote the first textbook of sociological fieldwork. And in that book, she explains how to use spot maps to identify these hard boundaries between areas of social cohesion and areas of social disorganization. She described these as permanent features of the city. They were, quote, "each a miniature society with its own history and traditions, its own individual problems, its own conceptions of its future." And the politics here directly echoed the small c conservatism of Burgess's stance on segregation, since Burgess promoted these areas not just as a description of the city, but also as a way to promote local identity and local government intervention. He lamented that, quote, "city life has lost its old local character," and he thought that these areas could, quote, "place social work on a local basis." Vivian Palmer went further, suggesting that if these areas were used for data and city planning, then city leaders could, quote, "take another pioneer step, one in the direction of social control." And in fact, their effort was a huge success. Burgess convinced the US Census to use these boundaries for reporting official statistics. His later students stopped making spot maps and started using these shapes instead. Here, for example, are maps from about 1940 showing dilapidated housing on the left and schizophrenia on the right. The city's most powerful post-war mayor, Richard J. Daley, invoked these areas when he began describing Chicago as a, quote, city of neighborhoods in the 1950s. In the early 1990s, a city ordinance conferred official status on the names that Burgess had chosen, with an alderman declaring them, quote, part of the character and history of Chicago. In other words, what we have here is Burgess's ideas about segregation, the idea that divisions of race, class, ethnicity, and religion are natural, inevitable, even beneficial. This became installed as a seemingly straightforward way to understand and govern the city. Burgess hypothesized the city as a series of hard-edged boxes, and then he turned his vision into reality. His maps weren't just powerful tools for finding patterns or showing data. They ultimately had the power to embed his own social vision into the fabric of the city. So all of this is what I end up responding to as a cartographer myself. But I came at it from a somewhat unexpected direction. About 10 years ago, I got an email from a middle school English teacher in the Chicago suburbs. He was going to be teaching a book about some of Chicago's most notorious housing projects, and he was worried that his relatively affluent students might struggle to understand the forces that put children exactly their age into an environment so radically different from what they understood. His solution had been to ask his students to make a series of maps, everything from demographics, poverty, and education to commuting and grocery stores. He sent the maps to me, asking if I could redraw them in a more professional style. Some of these were relatively straightforward. Here, for example, is the student's map about travel times to work. You can see they're using Burgess's community areas. You can also see what the teacher called the big blue job hole, a noticeable lack of local jobs on the South Side. Redesigning this was pretty straightforward. I added some streets, some parks, and changed the colors to emphasize the main idea. But one of the students' maps, the map of race, here, I found really challenging. The map they made was a total jumble of colors and stripes of different shades, and it was hard to see any patterns at all. And no matter what I did to change colors or fiddle with data categories, there were always parts of the map that didn't make sense. Something like this was the best that I could do, basically ignoring places without a clear majority. But once I downloaded the raw census data, I realized the deeper problem was actually the community areas themselves. They just didn't work. So here's what I ended up with. Instead of a few dozen large areas, I used data for about 100,000 individual blocks. And I showed race and ethnicity using a dense field of dots, not shapes. One dot for every 25 people, colored according to the categories used by the census. The official community areas are here, shown in black. And what we see is that racial and ethnic areas do sometimes stop abruptly at hard edges, but sometimes they fade slowly into each other, like this transition between the white and Hispanic areas on the north side. Sometimes there are large gaps with no housing at all. And it, of course, shouldn't be surprising that demographic patterns have changed since the 1920s. But the question isn't really whether the lines are in the right place. It's whether using lines makes sense at all. Now, it might be tempting to see this just as a question of technology or data, as if my map might be inherently better just because of its detail. But Burgess and his students had no problem dealing with huge amounts of detailed data. What's more important are the underlying ideas of homogeneity and transitions. These are what's driving the visual argument of both the jigsaw puzzle map and my alternative. The clean edges of Burgess's community areas anchor his argument about segregation as a natural and inevitable feature of the city. The lines argue for their own reality. They tell us that segregation is always well contained. The visual argument of my map is instead that smooth transitions are the norm. As a consequence, the sharp transitions that do exist on either side of a railway line or at a municipal boundary, they appear as distinctly artificial. The hard edges on my map demand an explanation. And this isn't a difference in how well my map and Burgess's show segregation. It's really a difference in our theories of segregation. Burgess thought that segregation was an inevitable result of the urban environment itself, free from the active hand of human intervention. My map instead shows segregation as an ongoing human project of enforcing lines that might not otherwise exist at all. Now, I don't want the lesson of Chicago to be that we should just use dots for everything, or simply that dots are good and shapes are bad. The real lesson here is that hard line boundaries are largely a cartographic fiction, and their politics tilt conservative, majoritarian, and technocratic rather than pluralist. And in the book, I show several other ways to challenge jigsaw puzzle mapping, even without the kind of huge data that we have from the census. And the quick example I'll share here is about the American Midwest. If you go to Wikipedia, this is the map you'll see, based on the definition of the Midwest by the US Census Bureau. It's a perfectly defensible definition, drawn by the lines of US history, but it's not the only possibility. And instead of trying to figure out whether this is the one best definition, my own map of the Midwest replaces this one definition with 100 overlapping definitions. To make this, I simply searched for maps of the Midwest online and combined them using shades of pink. The darker the shade, the more often that area was included in the maps I found. And I intentionally looked for maps that weren't necessarily meant to capture the correct Midwest at all. I wanted to see the Midwest in practice, not just in theory. My sources included everything from the chapters of the Haiku Society of America and the regional organization of the South African Consulate to the service areas of Plunkett's pest control. And this is really how cultural imagination works. Shared ideas are not shared equally by all. Different people and groups carry around different mental geographies, and it's just not the official answers are not the only ones that matter. And I end with this example because I think it's pretty easy. It doesn't require complicated software or thousands of data points. It requires just asking a different sort of question and looking for a different kind of answer. So this is where I'm going to end. I'm going to invite Ian now to join in the chat as I wrap up here. And hopefully I've convinced you of three things. First, the jigsaw puzzle maps are a problem, not because they're ugly or because they might be drawn with small amounts of data, but because they show the world in a way we know is not true. It's rare that geographic patterns change abruptly at a hard boundary. And when they do, it's a serious and often troubling exception. Second, I hope I've showed what it means to read a map for its visual argument, and that the visual politics of a map might be quite different from the politics of its creator. Bill Bungie, radical leftist, anti-segregationist, proud communist, made maps of race and inequality that were very similar to the maps of Ernest Burgess, a small c conservative with a commitment to natural segregation and gradual assimilation. For both, their maps were a form of homogenization and stabilization. Then third, I hope I've convinced you that we don't have to make maps this way, and there are real alternatives. The values of uncertainty, multiplicity, and subjectivity can lead to maps of a more diverse and pluralist world instead of a world of artificial stability and order. Thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Bill, thanks so much for this talk. Having looked through the book and seen the physical copy, which again, just as a plug, is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of work. It's really special to hear your reflection on this at a high level. Just by way of introduction, my name is Ian Spangler. I work here at the Leventhal Center, and I want to emphasize our gratitude for Margaret and Kathleen for their first-rate organization of this program. It might go without saying that as someone who works in a map library, we are very concerned with maps. We steward about 250,000 maps here at the Boston Public Library, flat maps, rolled maps, globes, charts, atlases. We have a Polynesian stick chart in our vault. And I always like to say that the best part of these maps are that they belong to you as members of the public. Many of them are online. Many of them are in your book, Bill. And that was very exciting to see. Many versions of the maps that we have, you are sort of drawing on as you tease out this notion of how a map becomes radical. And all of this is to say that radical cartography truly has been such a joy to read. I was really struck, Bill, by the end of your second chapter on layers, in a section where you describe your apprehension around presenting an unconventional map of Phoenix, Arizona, to the group of Phoenicians who had participated in. I didn't actually know that. That was something I learned from your book. The map that you created blends data across figure and ground to sort of argue that the desert constitutes what you call a patchwork of people and rights. And I want to quote you here. You write, I had worried that upending a century's worth of conventional cartography would be a heavy lift, but no one had any trouble unthinking the orthodoxy of background and foreground. The map made it easier for the group to talk about the politics of land use and development with me and with each other, and it put the city and desert into the same conversation. And when I read this line, I was immediately thinking about a map that we had on display in our gallery at the Leventhal Center last year. And I'm just going to show it to folks here. It's a map of Massachusetts areas of critical environmental concern. Now, in our show, which was called Processing Place and focused on the history of computer cartography, um, this map is sort of a jumble of all of those things that you're working out in your map of Phoenix, all of these different state claims to space and place. And when we had the privilege of giving a tour to some of the folks who made this map, one of them paused us and said, do you know why this map was so important? And my colleague Emily and I, who co-curated the show with, said no. And he pointed at the legend and said, the most important reason that this map exists was that it got all of these people to sit around the same table. And so I guess I want to close these sort of reflections on your book by just saying that I'm left here thinking about how maps function as propositions and how they offer, as you say, a sort of specific theory of geography to each map, but also about the unexpected processes by which maps might become radical in ways that their makers never actually anticipated or expected. And I think you give us a really joyful vocabulary for exploring this through the way that you blend map and memoir. If you have anything that you would like to, if that sparks any thoughts for you, Bill, I'll turn it over to you, and then maybe we can open it up to the audience questions. I see some people are dropping a few in the chat already.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ian. I think that one of the things that I guess I took for granted, but I've learned after having people read the book, is how much of the way that I interact with maps or make maps myself is about these conversations between me and other people. So many of the maps that I've made have been sparked by somebody sending me a question over email or sending me an idea that they've sketched out themselves. I think that goes against a lot of what we kind of assume about mapping, that there's a sort of all-powerful center somewhere that produces maps of the world that the rest of us must consume. And I think that what I've found in my own work, both making maps and teaching maps, is how much of the work of understanding the world comes through those kinds of sharing maps with other people, not just receiving maps from on high. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of approach these questions. We have about 20 minutes left. I thought that I might start seeding some questions from the chat here because I think there will be a lot to talk about from folks on the call. And I'm going to pop one over to you, Bill, from Margaret, who asks, aren't field and ground relationships an inherent weakness of our language-based psychology? Which raises a lot of, I think, really interesting questions around what cartographers often call the figure-ground relationship, or what designers call the figure-ground relationship. So I'll just say it one more time. Aren't field and ground relationships an inherent weakness of our language-based psychology? I'll turn it over to you.
So this is one of the things I think is one of those things once you start noticing it, you can't unnotice about most maps. Most maps have a background and a foreground. The background is coastlines, political boundaries, mountains, roads, whatever it is. And the foreground is, the excitement, the data, the demographics, the migration, whatever it is. And this seems so clean and obvious, uncontroversial. But what it really does is it says there are some things that you can kind of ignore. Put them in the background. They probably don't change that much. They're not that controversial. But actually, a lot of the things that are in the background are controversial things, like political boundaries are not the same as coastlines. Even saying that coastlines are the thing that we should use as the backdrop is itself rooted in certain ideas about what matters, right? That we care about land more than we care about, say, the oceans or marine resources or whatever, right? And in the book, this is, again, chapter 2, I talk about how this came to be and the people in the history of cartography who really pushed this idea that there should be a foreground and background to maps. And that's what made maps analytic in the first place, was that you had a strong contrast between foreground and background. And I think that there's something, we don't have to accept that. We don't have to say that maps must be made that way. And so I don't know that it's necessarily an inherent limitation. I think it's more something we can start noticing. And when we start noticing that, I think we can ask different questions about, should these things be relegated to the background? How do we think differently about things once we put them in the foreground? Things like that. So yeah, I think it's a great way to start thinking about maps in a new way, is to start seeing the background and foreground not as a given, but as something that is just a convention.
And I actually think that having a grasp on those conventions is just as important as having some sort of technical fluency and understanding how to work with software or draft geospatial data. So I really like that perspective.
Yeah, I'd say most of what I'm trying to do in the book actually is really trying to provide, as you said, a vocabulary for reading maps in a new way. I hope that some people who make maps will also read the book. But there's already lots of books out there about the technical stuff, right? And what I'm really trying to do here is to have a book that is trying to give us some words for saying, how do we find the meaning in maps? How do we describe what we're seeing?
I have a question from Bruce in the chat that I think is really a nice segue from this topic about sort of towing the line between reading maps and the vocabulary for reading maps and the sort of politics of representation. Bruce asks, I've been struggling with how to represent my family, genealogical, history, geographically. I've conquered the timeline problem, showing family in relation to historical events, but I'd like your thoughts on representing people in transition across time and place. Do you have anything that you would like to share with us based on this question?
I'm not sure that Margaret knew this when she set this event up, but I'm the family historian in my family. And actually, I made a family history book for my own children when they were young that we still bring out pretty regularly when they have questions about their family. So I have it here. Why don't I go ahead and share that as that part of my screen as well. Here it is. Great. So this is that. Actually, it's better this way. So this is that, and the simple thing I did was I have these kind of standard family tree diagrams, but every one of them I pair with a map. And these aren't complicated maps based on lots of data or anything like that. They're just a map that puts a label to everything on the chart. And what I found was that it really made it much easier to talk about the detail of the individual people here, especially when talking to family members who weren't as invested in the details of who all these people were. And I also noticed that even just noticing, for example, the kind of the way that certain regions cluster, I can see this is my own grandfather and grandmother in North Carolina, and how different that was from my maternal grandmother, whose ancestors did a lot more migration through the Great Plains and into the West. And so pairing every tree with a map, actually, I found to be not only a nice way to summarize everything, but a really nice way of talking about it. Another thing I did, it's pretty. Let's see. these are just some statistics you can see here that I grabbed from census records. But just making a map here of where my ancestors had gone on military service. So some of these required some mapping software, but a lot of them I think wouldn't. And they're things that I think that everyday people can do, even if it's just taking a map from the web, printing it out, coloring it in yourself, and then scanning it back in. I think there's a lot that simple maps can do to make family history kind of come alive a little bit more.
That's the one thing that jumps out to me about seeing the maps of your family history and also dovetails nicely on this question is the relationship between place and time. And you devote the final chapter of your book precisely to this topic, and it opens with this somewhat famous map of the Mississippi River and its meanders. Something that I've been thinking about as I read through your book is one of the joys in it is that it blends very old maps with very new ones, many of which are made by you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how these antiquarian maps and other maps that were made many centuries ago inform your notion of radical cartography, whether it's blending time or place or whether it's breaking down those hard boundaries, as you say.
Yeah, I think there's a few things here. One, I think that there is just in our kind of digital culture, maps and interactives online, I think there's a kind of assumption that all the good ideas must be from the last 10, 15 years. And that's just not true. People have been thinking about maps in very sophisticated ways for hundreds of years, but they've been thinking about data and statistical maps in particular for at least 150 or 200 years. And so a lot of it is that there's just a real joy in looking back on these old maps and seeing how they did things that some seem really far away and out of reach, and some seem really fresh and quite contemporary. And there's a lot of things that actually were easier to do with a pen on paper than they are on a computer. And so things like flow maps or drawing arrows and things like that, you see much more freedom, I think, in the old maps, showing those kinds of relationships of time or migration than you will in more modern maps, where there's much more reliance, I think, on shading areas with the everything a solid color or dot maps or little pins on the Google map. These are things that are easy to do with computers, and showing kind of flows and time and change is actually, I think, become a little bit harder. So some of it is just a joy in finding these old maps. I think another thing is that I'm coming at mapping as a historian, and I feel myself really understanding the kinds of maps that I want to make better as a response to the maps that we inherit from the past. And so seeing and really understanding the maps of the past and seeing, oh, how is this shaping our understanding of important parts of the world, of American history, of migration, and seeing what are the assumptions embedded in these old maps gives me a sense of, oh, maybe we should start mapping them in a different way now. And so that relationship between the sort of inheritance of the past and the way that I want to make maps now, I think is always there in the book. And it's genuinely part of how I come at this, because I see myself kind of inheriting these things historically and not just starting from scratch.
Yeah. I want to jump back into the chat because we have a lot of really great questions in here. Pam asks, as a young student, I never had an assignment which included creating a map. Was it encouraging to hear from a teacher for you? And have you continued to correspond with the teacher or their students?
It was really encouraging. I not only did I find it, a real source of kind of, inspiration to try to say, how do I solve this interesting question? But I really liked that the teacher was trying to figure out how to get these students to think about, place in a really specific way. And I've seen a bunch of different ways that teachers have done that. Teachers that I've corresponded with, other teachers in Chicago, not just that one. After I posted that map online, it's been used in other schools in the city. It's actually now part of the public school curriculum, that map of mine. But even just, I'm actually doing an event tomorrow with public school teachers here in New Haven, thinking about mapping the environmental history of New Haven. And I think there's lots of creative ways that teachers can and do integrate maps into teaching. And I think that the making of maps can be really not just really fun for students, but gets people to focus on things they wouldn't otherwise pay attention to. And I noticed that whenever I'm making a map, I inevitably just learn a lot more about the place. I'm actually there trying to figure out, oh, what's in that block? What do these dots mean? Why is the river shifted since the 1920s or whatever it is, right? So I think there is something really about getting in there and having to draw the lines or shade the things yourself that really leads to a more of an investment in the places you're mapping.
Yeah, I really love that that approach towards sort of participatory geography and participatory cartography. And there's always something really empowering about handing out a sheet of paper that people can place themselves in spatially. And I think that that ties you to space and place in ways that, especially with students and young kids, in ways that are tough to replicate in other methods.
Yeah. And one thing that I always say is that the first maps that I started making were a lot of them were hand drawn, and
Yeah.
I would get a gas station map, or I'd print out a map and I'd trace over it, or I'd scribble on it, and then I would just like take a photo and bring it into the computer and then trace over it in the computer because I didn't know how to use the mapping software. And there was actually a lot I could do just by scribbling on a piece of paper. And then, transferring that paper into a sharp, clean graphic that I could put on the web or, use in a publication. That was an important step of the process, but it wasn't the most important part of it, right? So I think that there is also a freedom that people can have, but just by scribbling, that they don't anticipate.
And in so many ways, even the sophisticated softwares that we have now do replicate that. And this is something else that you mentioned in your book is I think the first map that you created, if memory serves, was a map that's essentially digitally traced over this acreage calculation of different kinds of farmlands. And so you can see the sort of legacies of those historical, I mean, to speak of historical whatever, but older forms, pre-digital forms of map making
Yeah.
are really residual in modern forms. I know that we're very close to 7. There are a couple more great questions in the chat, so maybe we can try to move through a couple quickly. And I might even blend a few together because I think these
Great.
two at the top are about boundaries in interesting ways. So Larry asks whether you considered, for example, in the Chicago maps, both yours and the ones on which it was based, whether you considered things like the real estate industry's redlining practices that may have played a role in defining certain boundaries. And after this, another attendee has asked about some of the egregious examples of jigsaw maps in our modern day as the political division of entire states into red or blue. So I wonder if you have some thoughts about the ways that boundaries are defined, whether there are ideas, as our anonymous attendee asks, for helping to shift thinking away from those general population for the general population away from those simplistic models.
Yeah. So the history of redlining is super important. It's not something I address in the book, but it's certainly something that I teach in my classroom, and is something that there's actually all the redlining maps are now online. If you go searching for them, they're super important, and they did have a real impact on real estate and boundary making and that kind of stuff. And so I definitely was thinking about that. I was thinking about these divisions that I'm seeing. Where are they coming from, right? And I think that what was important for me was being able to see where those divisions really are, rather than assuming that they're there in the first place, right? For red and blue states, I think that's a classic and really important one. And I think that in the third chapter of the book, I have a few examples of election maps, especially election maps from other countries, where I think it's interesting to see some of the same issues, where you have kind of urban political parties and rural political parties, and you end up with different maps based on how you want to show that, right? So urban maps will distort maps based on population to show a more even balance of urban and rural votes. Rural parties will, of course, not do that, and will show almost all of the entire map shaded a single color. And so I think there's a lot of obvious politics in those kinds of maps. There's some obvious ways those maps mislead. And I think that the kind of where I personally land on that is that a lot of the solutions we have at hand are either doing real violence to rural areas, literally, squishing them and squashing them, or they're completely eliminating cities. So either you're making a map of rural areas or you're making a map that emphasizes cities. And in the book, I show a couple of ways that I try to say, can't we find a way to show both of them imperfectly rather than showing either rural areas perfectly ignoring cities or cities really well and ignoring rural areas? And I think that just leaning into the polarization cartographically is not where we should end up.
We probably have time for maybe one more question, maybe two, before we pivot towards final remarks. And Kathleen and Margaret, just chime in here if I'm off base. But we have an interesting question from a cartographer and urban designer and planner who often thinks that people on both sides of a street have more in common than is depicted on the typical map. And sort of encourages us to think about watersheds instead of hard boundaries. And so the specific question here is, what do you think of this sort of shed concept regarding, maybe there's a walk shed for a transit station? And I'll also maybe tuck this into another question from Lynn, who mentions that this sort of follows on to the previous questions about boundaries. What your ideas are for accessible approaches that we might use to break down these boundaries for different understandings about how people experience and have lived understandings of the places that they see and use in maps.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, thinking about space in terms of watersheds or other sheds instead of the kind of the straight line boundaries of municipalities or states. There's a long and really interesting history of that bioregionalism of various kinds. And in the book, one of the later maps, the last maps actually of the chapter on boundaries, takes a different approach to this, which is to say, rather than trying to say, well, states are the problem, watersheds are the solution, I make maps that say, how similar are the places that I know to everywhere else in the country or in the continent? So instead of having a yes/no answer, it's a sort of shades of familiarity. So I compare the tree species in the forest near my house with the composition of trees throughout the rest of North America. And so instead of saying I'm part of a single region, I'm saying I have lots of different kinds of connections, some weaker, some stronger, to lots of different places. And maybe another way into that, the second kind of question, again, rather than trying to say what's the one correct way to represent things, say what are all the different ways, all the things that are important, and how do we overlap them? And say, yes, there's watersheds. Yes, there's soil districts. Yes, there's climate gradients. Yes, there's demographics. And how do we put them all together and get a different kind of, more or layered blob rather than a single correct answer?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that multiplicity as a response. Bill, we have time for maybe one more general question, and I think that I'll toss it out to you. Because I suspect the audience here might be interested in hearing you comment on how maps might be helpful to family historians more generally in the study of the past, and how they can be used for genealogists in the presentation of one's family history. I mean, you talked a little bit about this already, but if you have any extra remarks about family history mapping.
That's great. So so I showed a couple examples of just what I've done myself for sharing this with other people in my family. But in terms of the research and trying to understand family history, I think that there's two scales that maps can be really helpful. There's the big macro scale of just understanding the major shifts and migrations of American history or history or wherever your family is from, and to see how does my family history fit into these larger narratives? Which American story is my American family part of? And I think that there's a lot of maps that can help do this. There's, atlases of American history. There's sites like socialexplorer.com can give pretty quick access to census data, things like that. It can be really good for contextualizing your family to say, is this a typical thing for a family to have done, or is my family an outlier? And that sense of typical or not through maps, I think, can be really powerful. The other answer would be maps can really help you zoom in to particular streets and blocks. I know at the Boston Public Library, they've just developed a new tool called Atlas Scope, which lets you, just for Boston, see old maps of the city overlaid on the modern map of the city. And so you can see which buildings were there, what were they made of, who might have owned them in various points in the past. And I think that that's also super powerful to be able to, take the manuscript census and to say, oh, I've got an address, and to find that address, not on the modern Google map, which might not even have that street or that building anymore, but to find that on a historical map that gives you I think, a real rich sense of context for what that neighborhood might have been like at the time, and to be able to see, yeah, my ancestors were in that building, I think is a really powerful way to connect yourself to place.
What an amazing conversation you gentlemen have had. And it's just fantastic that you've shared Atlas Scope and Social Explorer and some tools for all of us, actionable maps indeed. We really appreciate this illuminating discussion. We've learned a lot. A reminder to our audience, copies of Radical Cartography can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you place your order on the bookstore's website, input the code AMINS25 so you receive tonight's specially signed book-plated edition. For map lovers and social scientists among your friends and family, this book could be the really perfect holiday gift. I know I'm not parting with mine. I love my copy. It's remarkable, and I will treasure it. Your gifts and your books can be sent anywhere in the United States from the bookstore. Unfortunately, they can't make it to Canada, so you'll have to stay in the U.S. Now, winding down our evening together, first, Ian, do tell us what's upcoming at the Leventhal Map and Education Center.
Yes. So over the next couple of weeks, we host From the Vault programming physically here at the library in the Boston Public Library Central Library at Copley Square. We'll be hosting two events that are free to the public, a From the Vault about facades of urban past, cities in perspective. That's on December 12th. And the following week on December 19, we'll have a From the Vault program focused on the center's favorite maps of 2025. So if you're in the area, please stop by. And if you're not, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter, easy to find online. And we have a ton of virtual programs coming down the pipe next year, one of which we'll actually see Bill again in February for sort of another rendition of this book talk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ian. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have co-presented tonight's talk with you. It would not have been possible without your expertise. So thank you. Out there in the audience, if you're researching a community, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help you, genealogists. You'll see on screen some of the educational programs hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center. Many of them are free to the public. As a free service, you can chat with one of our genealogists. Better yet, visit us in our new exhibitions at 97 Newbury Street here in Boston. Our Family Heritage Experience, our new revised building here. We welcome you. You can see firsthand what we do and the wisdom gained from family history research. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you author book lovers ahead, there are so many of us out there. I want to call your attention to some upcoming talks on December 10, also in partnership with the Boston Public Library. We'll focus on colonial Virginia when Andrew Lawler presents his book, A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. You'll learn a lot about Lord Dunmore. In the new year, we'll dive deeper into America's colonial and revolutionary history. On January 12, our focus will be on the Great Wagon Road. It makes a beautiful map, this Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania to Georgia. And James Dodson's new book, The Road That Made America. And on January 21, we're going to welcome Rick Atkinson, who you saw most recently often on Ken Burns's American Revolution series. He was the voice behind all those maps, which battles where. He'll be discussing his book, The Fate of the Day, and his trilogy on the American Revolution with our president, American Ancestors President Ryan J. Woods. They'll also look at the craft of writing histories. Back to tonight, many thanks to our featured guests, Bill Rankin and Ian Spangler. Gentlemen, that was a remarkable conversation. We're very, very grateful. And I'll have to come out in February again. We're all grateful to Kathleen McKenzie, tonight's tech producer behind the scenes. But thanks most of all to you in the audience out there. We are so glad you joined us. We appreciate and applaud your interest in history and in maps. And we'll hope to see you again. For now, a good night to everyone, and thank you again, Bill and Ian.